welcome to our viewers coming to you from Abu Dhabi. I'm Costanza Maya, and this is TGTV Talk First, an uncensored, student-led debate show for the Global Network University and beyond. We are a new initiative of the Gazelle, which is a student-run, independent online publication at NYU Abu Dhabi. So on today's show, we reflect on gender values. With regards to the multicultural body of NYUAD, we want to talk about the relationship between our values on gender and the gender dynamics that we encounter on the street in Abu Dhabi. Joining us are three guests from NYUAD's academic body. So to my left is Mohamed Amine Belarbi, a sophomore at NYUAD from Rabat, Morocco. This is Nafisatou Mounkaila, a freshman at NYUAD from the Bronx in New York. And this is Carlos Guedes, head of the music program at NYUAD and from Porto, Portugal. So welcome.
Thank you.
So to start, let me contextualize. As in any city, right? In Abu Dhabi, there are certain gender dynamics happening on the street. There's a distinct dress code, right, for men and women. Intergender display of affection is not allowed. Some areas, like waiting rooms, for example, are separated by gender. NYUAD's multicultural body may or may not have the same cultural values on gender as those we encounter on the street, right? And this prompts some reflection. I'd love to hear your general impressions before we start. Carlos, why don't we start with you?
Well, yes, what you're saying is all true, but I found it since moving here and moving here with my wife. I found that these are not so strict, these all dynamics, so I feel comfortable walking, holding hands with my wife, and initially we felt all this pressure because that's what you read in the tourist guides, that public displays of affection are not well seen, something like that. And initially we were a little bit afraid, but we could see that there's actually a very tolerant thing going on, because you don't feel that much pressure.
Okay.
That said, I also very aware that I'm in a different country that has a different culture, and I feel obliged to respect those values and not to impose them. So if in some way it was really discouraged public displays of affection, I would probably refrain myself from holding hands with my wife, just for the sake of respect of the culture.
Okay.
Because I think you should be careful to not offend people in a very gratuitous way.
Definitely. So let's. I want to get back to that theme of respect, but let's hear from the other guests first before we move on. So Mohamed, how about your general impressions before?
Yeah, pretty much of the same opinion as Professor, because pretty much I spend every weekend in Dubai, and there sometimes it is more liberal than if you're walking up Beverly Hills, believe me. So it is actually contextual based on where you are and what you're doing. Of course, like in an educational setting like NYU Abu Dhabi, you have pretty much a multicultural pot, where everyone mixes. So you have different displays of whether it is your way you display your affection, or whether it is the gender dynamics. Same thing in Dubai, in financial centers or in shopping malls. These things are, although there are written rules, it is far from being really respected or viewed as something that's obliging everywhere. But of course, if you are in a setting that requires you to be somehow respectful, whether it is a mosque or it is in a familial setting where people are not as prone to see these kind of affection displays as liberally as we think, then it is good to be mindful. And this is something that's quite relevant to all parts of the world, not necessarily Abu Dhabi or the UAE.
Sure. So again, this theme of being mindful and respectful. Nafi?
I think I would basically share the same ideas here. Upon arrival, I knew that there were certain rules, certain regulations, things of that nature, and they didn't seem like they were impeding on my freedom or anything like that. It was just a matter of you're in a different place now, so you adhere to the different rules and different expectations. So it was pretty straightforward for me when I came here, and it's been that way.
So do you feel like there haven't been any moments where perhaps values that you have, say from where you come from, these values haven't been perhaps put into question?
I don't think values necessarily. I just think scenarios. So, for example, sometimes when I'm walking in the street, I know it's much less women on the street than back home in the Bronx, back home in New York, and that's just a fact. That's what I see, and so I wouldn't say values, but just scenarios or sort of circumstances.
And have there been any scenarios perhaps that have made you feel uncomfortable at all here?
No.
Okay, and yourself?
Not necessarily uncomfortable.
Okay. So, Khulud Kitani, who is an Arabic language instructor at NYU Abu Dhabi, gave us this really interesting quote, which says, "I support my friends and students of other genders," and she's Muslim. "They do the same to me with full respect to my practice. So they do not hug me, but I do know how much they love me. Though I break the rules sometimes. If someone is sick, I just hug my male friends and students, which, in parentheses, is not accepted in Islam," end quote. So I'm wondering if we can talk about how lenient we should be with our values. Because sometimes you come to these situations where perhaps we need to change our values. What do you think, Mohamed?
I think I'd rather disagree with the fact saying that it is about changing values. I think it's rather about how you express them, because the value of loving each other or the value of caring about each other, that's something that is universal. And that's what, for example, something she expressed in her quote. The way you express that is different across cultures and across religions. It's also, obviously, I think something to celebrate rather than something to question, because if we're all the same, then what's there left to learn from each other? And I'd like to put a quote here from Kashi, which she always likes to say so much that I learned at some point. She says, "We relate to each other because we're similar, but we learn from each other because we're different." So these values bring us together, for example, as a community in NYUAD. But the way we express it makes it an interesting experience, because we get to learn about how different people view different values, and that's something that's quite interesting. I think something to value as much as we came here looking for that experience.
So, but talking about forms of expression, some people might say that, for example, in the UAE, because there are this dress code or this way of behavior, they feel as an obstacle to express these ways of caring, for example. What do you think about that?
I have a cute story to tell you. Because being Portuguese, in Portugal, it's very normal for people from the different gender to say hello by kissing. So even when you introduce somebody new to somebody else, people just kiss. It's normal. I lived for 7 years in New York. When I moved to New York, the first time I was introduced to a woman, I say hi and I give her 2 kisses, and she blushed and looked at me like panicking. It's like, did I do something wrong? And then, subsequently, eventually I started teaching at NYU in New York. And then I started realizing that, not only, of course you cannot kiss people, but then, when relating to students from the opposite sex, namely Koreans, for example, it's also, they have very problems regarding being touched, and I'm a very touchy person because, I'm a Southern European, and Southern Europeans are very touchy. And of course, for the sake of respect from them, I could not do something that they would find offensive, in the sense that, I can be doing this to you while talking to you, and then if you find it extremely offensive and I'm just trying to be friendly with you, then there's some miscommunication going on. And that's a very tricky thing, and I think you have to be aware of the things that I can agree more with Mohamed, so that you don't give out a wrong message, and also should show some respect to other people by respecting them. If that's something that makes them uncomfortable, I see no problem. Why should you just insist on imposing your own cultural ways of dealing with people?
So I'm wondering though, where is the line of respect, right? Because, for example, some things here in the UAE are not just not well tolerated by the society, but also criminalized. For example, sometimes, as a law, consensual sex outside of marriage is illegal. And so, for example, 2 days ago, the Gulf News reported that a clerk and a housemaid were caught having consensual sex outside of wedlock and were arrested. Now, does this line of respect, where do we draw it? Nafi?
It's a tough one. Where do we draw it? When I think about, the UAE and things of that nature, this is an Islamic country. And there are certain for example, this consensual sex is not accepted in Islam. But then you have these two people who probably aren't Muslim, and they have done this, and I wouldn't know how to deal with that. You know, I just wouldn't know what even to say about whether or not.
What to say about what specifically?
Well, basically, just the whole situation, because I find myself just like, well, I don't know. This is a country, and it's following Islamic law, I guess, and so they think that the best solution is to arrest these people. I mean, I'm coming from Bronx, New York, where New York and the U.S. is not an Islamic country. People do this all the time. So obviously, I would just see it as, well, people do what they do, you leave them, and you go about your own life, you go about your own beliefs.
But in this case, it perhaps may have some implications on you, for example, living in Abu Dhabi. Mohamed, what do you think about this line of respect?
I think it's not only a matter of respect, but also it's a matter of intergenerational understanding of these kind of behaviors. For example, the people ruling in the UAE are not like 25 years old youth who are like more open to liberal ideas. Maybe like this is something that takes time, I'd say, because to influence policy is not a matter of just importing outside understandings, outside representations of how you show care, how you show love to each other. For example, in the US, that's kind of translates into sexual intercourse. Here, it translates in other ways. So what I'd say is, the fact that you have more and more people coming in this country that have opened itself as a melting point for different cultures and different religions is going at some point to elaborate or to crystallize into kind of a more open policy for accepting these kind of behaviors. That takes time.
So you think that having more diverse people coming into this place is going to open up the UAE's, relax maybe the UAE's policies on gender, or these codes on gender?
I don't think so, because even like among young people, these things happen. And like you don't have a camera in every house trying to monitor whether you're doing these things or not. See? So this is sometimes you're just making an example, the ruling party is trying to make an example of these kind of behaviors. You shouldn't do this because we're in an Islamic country. But in fact, they're very relaxed on these policies because they're not going around like trying to check whether that's happening or not. So it just takes time in order to kind of mildly transition. You cannot have an abrupt transition.
How do we actually transition right now? So because it might be transitioning maybe in a few years, but we're living in Abu Dhabi right now. And how do we internalize this transition? What do you think, Carlos?
Well, it's a very complex issue, but I think I agree with Mohamed. It takes time. I mean, they're asking for it because, I mean, being accepting so many immigrants and so many different people from different parts of the world, at some point, I think people here will be conscious of the fact that at some point they will probably need to ease some laws to make people feel more comfortable. And I think that there's this trade that needs to happen between
But what
families.
are we trading specifically? What are we trading? What does this trade look like? What does it mean practically?
I mean, it's a complex issue and a complex question because, I mean, you're here, you're not obliged to be here, you're here because you want. Being here, you have to abide by their laws, okay? You can't agree or disagree with them. You should not impose, I think, well, as immigrants, of course, we're imposing certain things and we're imposing them probably in a passive way. And this, with some time, will make the society change. You know, this has happened not a place in the world. You know, the role of women, for example, in the United States or in Portugal, or, you know, now Portugal, for example, recently is one of the first countries in the world to accept gay marriage. We're a Catholic country. I mean, it's quite surprising from being an extremely conservative country before the Revolution in '74 that, you know, after 30 years, you pass a law that in which you allow gay people to get married. Mm. You know, and these things were happening peacefully, and these things happened because, you know, the Portuguese society, in a sense, turned itself into a very tolerant society and accepting society. And I think, you know, the signs that I've seen here, I mean, there's one side of this, it's what you read, and sometimes what you read in the news that you have seems to be a very, you know, it has to have very, very tough and strict rules about certain things. Which, again, I mean, if you don't want to be punished and abide by these rules, I mean, you shouldn't be here. Once you're here, then you have to accept the fact that you may be able to held accountable if you don't respect those rules. That said, on the other hand, I think that's contributing in order to change the society and turn this into a more tolerant society. And
especially because we're living in a country where there are so many more immigrants than
absolutely.
Emiratis, for example, and so many more men too than women. So, for example, the UAE ranks first in men to women ratio. I don't know if you knew that. So
I didn't know that.
19 men per women.
Okay.
How do we push these boundaries if it's something that we know is moving towards a transition? We're living in some place that we understand to be conservative, but also perhaps we don't agree with, I don't know, but want to try to be respectful of. Are you pushing these boundaries, Nafi? Do you feel? Do you
Boundaries in terms of like
of respect? Or are you pushing these boundaries in terms of the transition towards, like you're saying, Mohammed, perhaps a more liberal side?
pushing them? I just got here, you know? I mean, I'm still like trying to grasp your question here.
You feel like you're still trying to understand how to respect this, but also be yourself? Is that one?
That's it. Okay, so, I mean, yeah, the understanding and the adapting is going to take a really long time for anybody, even aside from the gender issues, just the whole scenario and whatnot of being in a whole different country. But, I mean, some of these things coincide. Well, I'm a Muslim, you know, and if there are certain things like, you know, that are seen as more conservative, they might just be what I go with in terms of like public display of affection and things of that nature. So, I mean, I don't feel like I'm like just lost, completely lost in this whole new world, but at the same time, it's gonna take some getting used to understand that there's actually laws that say, hey, you cannot do this because you can be punished for this.
And so how do we feel like perhaps we can talk about these things? Obviously this is a format, but is humor a format, I'm wondering? So I don't know if you're familiar with the chickpea, I don't know, but it's NYUAD's satirical piece. And in the beginning of the semester, they released an article, completely fictional, that was titled, "Homely Student Relieved to be Back Amongst Abu Dhabi's Pakistani Laborers." One of the sentences, again, completely fictionalized. Goodwin, the student, reported on Tuesday that she had never been happier to be back in the lustful sights of Electra Street's day laborers. Now, is this a fair way to talk about these gender dynamics that are going on using humor?
Well, I've heard about the incident, and what was put in question was not necessarily how you talk about gender issues or about sexuality in this country, but rather how the labor has been portrayed. Because some people found that it was degrading to actually call all the laborer as lustful male, just looking for, I wouldn't say the word, but like, so sometimes we need to draw the boundaries and differentiate when we're talking about like sexuality or gender and when we're talking about how we picture other people, because it's quite a sensitive issue here. Pakistani or Bangladeshi or Indian labor here are, of course, subject to many constraints, many degrading, let's say, treatments, whether it is in the construction sector or in other sectors. And sometimes we tend to forget that these expressions that like, or these the ways to behave in public, whether it is looking at girls or looking at women, is something that's not necessarily shouldn't be taken out of context. Because these guys work 12 hours a day.
It should be taken out of context, but it still may be something that goes against someone else's gender values, right? Coming from a different culture. Again, we said that there's many immigrants here, many more than Emiratis. So, do we not discuss it?
No, we definitely should discuss it, but we should be mindful of not generalizing and including their voices also. Because have these people been consulted, have these people have a say on the issue? I'm sure like they did it. So sometimes it is, when we're talking about liberalism, for example, that we want to see more in this country, liberalism asks for multiple voices when you're talking about an opinion or some subject. So if we want actually to only take parts of liberalism and claim that is the way to go forward, it becomes sometimes too sensitive. It is like whether we either take it all or we don't take it at all. So that's why I'm saying if we're talking about democracy and the plurality of opinions, the plurality of voices, then even in something as trivial as an opinion piece in the GP, you should have also other people's voices represented.
And you agree?
Yes, and I think, for example, things like this program is a nice way of making things change, in a positive and gradual way. I think you cannot impose. I think I feel very, very bad in trying to impose my cultural values coming here, as being hired by an institution that is paid for by the government, and of course, I will always promote freedom of expression. I will always, try to challenge my students as much as I can, try to challenge their own values, and do all that. But one thing is inside the university, other thing is outside in society, and you have to be careful. And that doesn't mean that I'm going to be a different person outside of the university. I'm going to be more mindful and probably careful, because something that I may be doing that can be, not even on purpose, can offend somebody.
So,
and this is from the example that I just told you from my experience in the United States, a supposedly very open society, but then, you also have their system of values in which people abide by, and there are certain things that are okay, other things that are not that okay, and you just have to understand them. And once you're from a different culture and a different country and a different system of values, I think being able to deal with this and in a positive way, not being able to on the one hand say, oh, they're all wrong and I just want to go back to my place and stay there and that's it. Or the other hand say, oh, they're totally wrong and I just want to invade them, with my good bag of values, and impose them to everybody, because I think that's the way it should be. I think these two extremes are the worst thing you can do.
So perhaps on this note of respectfulness and being mindful, since we're coming to the end of our show, do we want to just take, Nafi, your last thoughts, since you guys have shared last thoughts already, maybe 30 seconds and then we'll close out? Being respectful in this line.
These guys really just hit it perfectly. Just this idea of, staying true to yourself, staying true to your values, but being mindful, you know that we're not in Kansas anymore, you're somewhere else. So you just gotta be mindful, and as long as you don't feel like you're compromising too much of yourself or you're impeding on the host country, then you should be good.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mohamed, Nafi, and Carlos, for joining us. We'll see you next time on TGTV. I'm Costanza, and see you next time.